Thanks everyone for coming back after dinner, or lunch even. We appreciate people being here. So we're here to talk about a bunch of Apple EFI research that we did. And this is actually a recently updated version of the work. We released some of this back in October time. We've updated a lot of this for the High Sierra release and a lot of the changes that came in with 10.13. So a bunch of new content in here today, as well as a bunch of analysis on some of the APIs that we released to help with some of the problems that we've identified. And we can get a lot of information out from the usage of those APIs that we hope is going to be interesting as well. So who are we?
Hi, everyone. My name is Pine Brienne. I'm an R&D engineer with Duo. I work in the Duo Labs group. I do R&D, obviously, because of my title. I like to reverse engineer and break things that are Apple, specifically macOS stuff. Also a recovering Mac admin, which explains why I want to break Macs. And I also maintain a couple of open source tools that are used pretty frequently among the Mac admin crowd.
And my name, Rich Smith, a little bit easier to remember than Pepine's name. As you can tell by my accent, I spend my time between New York, Detroit, and Reykjavik. It's actually the first time I've been back to the UK in many, many years. So it's nice to be back, at least for like 36 hours before I run away again. So I'm director of R&D at Duo Labs. Duo Labs is the research arm of Duo Security, which you'll probably know for kind of Duo Push and a lot of multi-factor authentication stuff. Also co-founder of Syndis, which is a red team company out of Iceland. My research tends to be around post-exploitation, a lot of frameworks in that space. I enjoy firmware, obviously, Python, and like some large-scale, internet-scale research studies where we're looking at empirical data. So enough about us, actually get into the work. So before we dig into the details, what's kind of the TLDR? Like what was in our heads when we started this work, when we actually started to put a lot of time into this? So at conferences like Black Hat, like DEF CON, CCC, there's been loads of great EFI vulnerabilities that have been worked on. Lots of great offensive work that has been done, finding lots of problems. We were interested in then, how are those vendor responses that address those problems making it in reality? Like, who was actually patching the issues that had been found? And when those patches were released, how well were they getting applied into the real world? So that was really what started our work here and led the approach that we took. And really extending out from EFI security, we really wanted to extend a lot of questions that we had around how firmware security mapped up against software security. So over the last number of years, there's been a lot of mantra around kind of keep things patched, pushing on vendors to actually release updates in a timely manner. And the mantra that a lot of people get is if you're keeping your things up to date, you're going to be running faster than most bears. You're going to be okay. If you're going to do nothing else, keep things up to date. We wanted to measure how well that actually maps to firmware space. So we feel software security has got to a much better place than it has been in terms of the availability and how well people are going about installing the patches. We wanted to ask a lot of the similar questions about firmware security and see whether it was kind of on par with software security or it was falling well behind. So the super TLDR on a lot of the research that we did, we analyzed all of the OS security updates that Apple had released really over the last 3 to 4 years from 10.10 through to 10.13. This gives us an insight into what was being fixed at the EFI and firmware layer. Then we also got data from more than 73,000 real-world systems. And then we were able to map the efficacy of what Apple had released to what was actually deployed in the wild. And as we'll go into how Apple releases its EFI updates, is very closely bound to the software updates that it releases. So we should have a one-to-one mapping between the expected state of security software and the expected state of the security of the firmware. We found quite divergent states, and that's what led to a lot of our other work. But this was really the TLDR for what drove a lot of our research, the comparison between firmware security and software security, and trying to make sure that we understood how well patches that had been released were actually landing on real boxes. Which brings us to our next question. Why Apple? Like, why are we ragging on Apple for this? Well, we're not. In reality, it turns out we're pretty lazy researchers. Apple controls the whole stack. So they control hardware right the way through to software, obviously including the firmware in between. And this vertical integration that Apple controls gives us a much more manageable data set to answer some of these questions by. On the Wintel side of the world, it's definitely more fragmented. It's a much more heterogeneous environment. And that just means that the data analysis that we do is much more complex. So we got lazy. We started off with the easy data set. There is nothing to say that the work that we've done doesn't apply equally to the Wintel world. And from the small amount of work that we've done in the Wintel space, we strongly believe that the state of EFI security in the Wintel world is much, much, much worse than in the Apple world. We spoke with Apple from the earliest days of our findings, so way back in kind of June of this year. They've been great to work with. They've responded very well. They've built up a world-class firmware security team at Apple. So we actually believe, despite some of the issues that we have found, they're actually leading the way with the way that vendors are thinking about EFI security in particular, and the way that they're going about trying to keep their firmware in lockstep with their software and with respect to security. So, yeah, we ragged on Apple, but that wasn't really the point. And the reason that we focused on Apple was it was the easiest data set for us to analyze. So, quick overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to take you through kind of an EFI 101. We're aware that not everybody is super familiar with EFI. We're going to talk about some Apple specifics on EFI as well, how the updates are applied, how things are reflashed, and just essentially give you some context around which the work is based. Then we're going to dig into the newer work, what we did, what we found, what you can do, and things that we've released to try and make your lives a little bit easier, and gather more information about the problem as well in the course of that. So, over to Pepijn.
So hopefully I don't have to go into too great detail as far as what EFI does, what it stands for, Extensible Firmware Interface. So we'll run through this pretty quickly. I want to focus on how Apple has been using this so far. So I think we're pretty aware that EFI is running on a lot of devices nowadays as part of the lower level management systems that are part of many systems these days. So Intel started working on their version of EFI in the mid-1990s to replace the aging and severely lacking BIOS, lacking for a number of reasons. It's 32-bit, had very limited storage capabilities. It was generally time for a replacement. They worked on that for a little bit, and then in 2005, the UEFI standard was initiated. Intel joined the UEFI group to add their work that they had already done to come up with the unified EFI standard. And Apple, as such, started using EFI for their own products in 2006. Why was that? Why did Apple actually need to switch or chose to switch? So 2006, if you remember, is also the year that the first Intel powered Macs shipped. So Apple needed to make some other major changes besides the lower level systems they were using. They could no longer use open firmware, which was at that point a PowerPC legacy, so they couldn't really make that work. That wasn't part of the Intel platform. So they switched to EFI. First models that shipped, iMac, a MacBook Pro, and that quickly spread to all the other systems. And it needs to support a number of Mac-specific things like NetBoot, which is where you hold down a key and it will actually find a network boot very similar to a Pixie, and also Internet Restore, which is a sort of an internet-powered version of that. And it is just like open firmware and any other of these systems were in the past, it is entirely invisible to end users. So most users are not aware that this is even a thing or something they need to care about. Why should they care?
So why should they care? It's a good question. So from an attacker's perspective, why is EFI even an interesting target to attack? And it kind of, for me, breaks down into these three areas. There was an earlier talk today with discussing a lot of the Intel ME background. And there was a much prettier pyramid on that, talking about the various levels of the system interface. With respect to EFI, the important thing is this here, like where this sits beneath the applications and the OS, and even the hypervisor. So ring 3 and ring 0 are the traditional Intel protection rings that we've heard about. These kind of made up rings -1, -2, -3, depending on whose model that you're using, really are just indicating layers of the system which operate beneath the traditional protection ring layers. And the lower down this stack you go, the more information that you can get from the upper layers. Anything low down should be able to, with a small number of caveats, access anything above it. There are interfaces that allow higher levels to get access to some of the information from the lower level interfaces, but they tend to be much more restrictive. So if you've successfully attacked EFI, if you've managed to get your code running in EFI, this means that you can affect and interrogate anything at the layer above it. The TLDR of this would be you can effectively read or write any memory location or any disk location with a couple of caveats around SMM, Intel ME, within the stack. So if you're running a compromised EFI, you've kind of got keys to the kingdom. So from an attacker's perspective, you can do most anything if you've managed to get your code running in the EFI level. That's pretty cool. Then there's these two other aspects which are actually really quite key to this. The stealth aspect of EFI is if you've compromised somebody's EFI, it's actually incredibly difficult for them to tell. It's not impossible, but the amount of work that's required to determine that you have a compromised EFI is significant. A lot of that becomes the security software that people are using is either happening at ring 3 or ring 0. From those layers, essentially EFI running at 2 layers beneath that can lie. Any introspection that would be coming from those layers of the system, EFI, if it's trying to be evasive, could lie to those higher level layers of the system and enables it to be very stealthy. If you pull the chip off the board and interrogate the contents of the SPI flash, then, yep, you could start to diff out and see that you were running code that you probably weren't expecting to. But that level of introspection requires physical access to a system. Very, very difficult compared to most other compromises to realize that you're running compromised EFI code. And then, equally, the persistence part. If I've managed to get my attack code into the EFI layer, it's pretty difficult to remove me. So often people will say things like, reinstall your OS. Well, that's not going to remove me from the EFI portion because I'm in SPI flash. It's also, if you completely rip out the disk and put a new disk in, I'm still in the flash. So the persistence level combined with the stealth level, combined with the ability to access most every aspect of the system actually makes EFI attacks very attractive for sophisticated adversaries. And this is why we've seen a lot of research in the space, because once you've got this, it kind of is keys to the kingdom. But the caveat really is, who would want to attack EFI? This is not a script kiddie situation. We're not going to see this as part of drive-by web browser attacks. This, well-funded adversaries, so in the same breath that we're saying kind of nation states and industrial espionage, this is the kind of tool, sophisticated targeted attacks. We're not talking about just indiscriminate internet-wide attacks. So in terms of threat model, often at these kind of conferences, people like to stand up and say, the sky's falling, and whatever we found is like the worst thing in the world ever, and try and get some press out of it. Specifically with this level of attack, really is focused on sophisticated adversaries, and if they're not included within your threat model, if your threat model doesn't need to compensate for Mossad, probably not going to lose sleep over the fact that the EFI is not being updated in the way that we would expect, and we'll dig into that more later. But having the context of a threat model is important when you're thinking about new work that's being discussed. So we've spoken a little bit about the historic EFI work that others have done. This is like the highest level, quickest overview of some of the biggest work that's been in the space. Kind of all started with Snare, a US black hat back in 2012. He did some of the first work showing that a doctored Thunderbolt adapter could be used to overwrite and inject arbitrary code into EFI. This was the first work that, well, I'm aware of at least, that started to take place there. And then we're kind of jumping around in timeline. So Sonic Screwdriver, this was out earlier this year as part of the Vault 7 kind of WikiLeaks dump. It is a commonly believed knowledge that this dump reflects something that came out of the CIA. And also from all the analysis that have been done on the areas, people believe that this work, the Sonic Screwdriver work, was really a weaponized implementation of what Snare spoke about in 2012. Then we start to get like a couple of years ahead. Trammell Hudson is going nuts with Thunderstrike 1, really extending on a lot of what Snare did. Thunderstrike 2 took it to a whole new level because now this was a software-based attack. Up until this point, Sonic Screwdriver, Thunderstrike 1, Snare's original work, this all required physical access to the system to plug something in, abuse some DMA privileges, take advantage of some problems with EFI, and then get your code running in the EFI. Thunderstrike 2 took that into the software domain. You didn't need to have physical access to the system. You could do it all from software space, which is pretty impressive. If you're not familiar with this work, that's Trammell, Zeno, Kova, Corey Kallenberg. Check out the work. It's an incredibly elegant piece of research. And this took it into the software space. And really at this point, and Pepijn will go into this a little bit more later, Thunderstrike 2 was a point in time that Apple significantly changed the way that they approached patching EFI and how seriously they took EFI security. So it's definitely a line in the sand. Ulf Frisk has also done some amazing work, PCI leech and a lot of the DMA attacks. Less focused specifically on attacking EFI itself, but using some misconfigurations and some aspects of the EFI to get what he needed to do done. Really, this work, the PCI DMA attack work, enabled him to extract a file vault 2 key from the disk. So essentially circumventing full volume encryption, the standard full volume encryption that comes shipping with Macs. Loads of other cool EFI research as well. Definitely check out Pedro's work. But if you want a background on EFI security and a lot of the research that's been done so far, check out these references. It's all fantastic work. This was a background against which we wanted to measure how well patches were actually being implemented in the wild.
So now that we have a little bit of a background of what we're trying to protect against and why it is important, we wanted to understand how Apple patches their systems against all of this. So like Rich said, 2015 was kind of a watershed moment for Apple. They needed to get a lot more serious about EFI updates. Prior to that, EFI updates were a manual process. There was a separate applications. The end user downloads, runs. It gives instructions on shutting the Mac down, starting it back up, holding down a power button, waiting for a long beep, et cetera, et cetera. That is not very scalable when you manage tens or thousands of Macs. And it was mostly ignored by most folks that either home users or anyone who manages Mac fleets, because it's kind of cumbersome and not really, it didn't get a lot of attention from Apple. 2015, or the after Thunderstrike era, so I like to call it, Apple needed to make some changes because they needed to get this stuff out there and not just wait for users to go through this system. So since then, Apple has shipped EFI firmware updates together with OS and security updates. How that works is that they embed a separate standard Apple PKG, a package installer, inside the OS installer that contains all of the EFI bundles, either SCAP or FD bundles. In the process of applying an OS or security update, this updater also runs, and through a number of invocations of specific tools that are built for this EFI update is one. It actually lines up, it checks whether an update needs to be done, and it lines up an update if so. And in a more graphical explanation of this is kind of how that works. So the larger OS install fires off the firmware update, kicks off a post install that does the work of determining whether an update is required, and uses the bless command to set some NVRAM variables, as well as copying the updated EFI firmware payload to the ESP volume called volumes EFI on macOS. And once that's all done, it waits for a reboot, and the next reboot, a EFI updater application actually boots and does the work. Important to note here that this is a one-time deal, so the updater gets one chance, and if it doesn't work, as we see later, there's not much visibility into that. So how does that updater actually figure out what to install? I said there's a number of files, firmware payloads that ship. How does the updater figure out how that works? So they have to ship a lot of these payloads. Does every model have its own file? How does this work? Does somehow the EFI payload contain this info, and how does the updater know? So a real quick brief through how Apple can tell models apart. So you may know of the slightly more consumer-friendly way of identifying Macs. They use a model name and then a number that kind of ticks up with either a generation, so 17,1 in this example. They may do comma 2, comma 3, depending on sometimes screen sizes, sometimes some other CPU configurations, but those overlap. They may refer to multiple different generations of hardware. So what Apple uses internally is called the board ID, which is an 8 or 16 character hex string. prepended with the Mac Dash, and those are actually unique to every model that they ship. So that is how Apple keeps track of what models. And when you look down here, you can actually see that the iMac used to have a laser. Anyway, iMac 70,1 actually covers 3 different board IDs. So it's important to know that that is not specific enough. So how does the EFI updater actually figure out what to use? So the EFI payload actually contains board IDs in a specific GUID. So in this case, this GUID here, we just cracked open EFIs and started looking for references, and that is where they are stored. So there's a header there, and 8-byte chunks are basically used to record the compatible board IDs for these, which are then grabbed by the IO registry API. And if a match is found between the system the updater is running on and that which is contained in the EFI payload, we have a match. And there's a little caveat here in that some models, 2 different physical models, use the same EFI bundle, and that is covered by the fact that this particular GUID can hold up to 15 board IDs. So if there's more than one listed, that same single payload file actually applies to multiple models. So that is how they kind of try to constrain how many actual physical files they need to ship. For QA reasons, we find out later that that can also get into some trouble. Visually speaking, this is kind of how this works. So the tool runs, does a check of the board ID of the running system, iterates over the EFI files, figures out which one is the matching one, and does the rest of the work of assigning the EFI firmware, which ultimately ends in a reboot and application of the firmware. We updated this research also a little bit with some of the new things found in 10.13 regarding EFI. So Apple is shipping a new tool called EFI Check. This tool is not meant to actually check version mismatches. It is an integrity checking tool. Zeno Kova, who was mentioned before, is now on the other side of the fence. He now works for Apple, trying to improve their EFI picture. And this is one of the first things that he worked out. He actually had a pretty lengthy tweet storm before he had to probably delete it, where he tried to explain what this sort of like inscrutable dialogue that may come up on your Mac under 10.13 actually means. So EFI Check has a whitelist bundle of checksums of all known EFI to Apple, and it turns out Apple knows about a lot more EFIs than even we know about. If that checksum somehow doesn't match, you get a dialog as seen below there that says you might have a potential problem. Would you like to submit this to Apple? That would actually submit the checksum to Apple so that they might augment their data, or possibly because there is code in there that's not expected. But generally speaking, Apple is working on making this, getting more visibility, as well as making this a higher priority, showing that EFI is actually on their list of things to worry about. So UX not great yet. Hopefully this will get better over time, but they have some privacy issues to deal with as well. They can't just grab this data and exfiltrate that without telling you. So that's what they're doing. Because of 10.13, APFS was rolled out across the board. They had to update some models that had not seen any updates since 2015. So they needed to ship an updated or an additional DXC driver, essentially, in order for EFI to actually be able to read from APFS volumes. So this means that a couple of models that so far had not gotten updates yet got updates in the models there, older iMac, MacBook Pro, and the Mac Pro. The Mac Pro is a special case because it is not able to be updated automatically. It actually has to fall back to the manual procedure that I referenced to before. What this means is that when you install macOS 10.13 on these machines, they will actually show this dialog below that make you go through the manual system again. So you actually have to click the shutdown button, hold down the power button on it again, wait for the beep, so it kind of falls back to that. But that's a one-time thing. Doesn't quite scale as well either, so we'll see how that works out in the field. And it just basically goes through, detects the model, checks the EFI version, loads a plugin that deals with this, and then does the same blessing as before, but it is a manual process. Those are some of the new things in 10.13 that we found. We didn't find any security updates that we can tell in those EFI updates for those older models, purely aimed at APFS compatibility. Rich?
So that was a lot of EFI background as well as Apple EFI background, and we realized that's kind of like a blitz. So go back over the slides and kind of dig in on particular GUIDs if that's the kind of thing that you're into. So now we've got the context out of the way. What the hell did we do? So like I say, a lot of what we were looking at was to shine some light into firmware security as opposed to software security. And so a lot of, any research starts out with hypotheses and questions, and these are a bunch of our questions. Pepijn walked us through how the EFI updates are contained within the larger OS and security updates released from Apple. Do they work? When we try and install them, do they take every time? Are equivalent EFI updates released for all supported hardware, or is some hardware treated differently than others? Similarly, are some versions of the OS treated differently than other versions of the OS? EFI is independent of the OS, so there's no reason that if a vulnerability is being addressed in EFI for a particular problem that's been found, that should be equally delivered across any version of the OS that Apple is continuing to support. And then obviously, we can see what Apple is releasing based on different hardware types, based on different OS types. What we're also interested in is then the real world when people have actually updated to whatever version of the OS. Like, what is the state of their EFI? So does the real world match the ideal world? And if any of the answers to these things above return a no, then how easy is it for users or administrators of Apple fleets to actually work out that their EFI is divergent and possibly vulnerable, and then kind of what to do about it? So these were like a lot of the high-level research questions that we entered into the work with, and that led our direction of where we walked through things. So what was the analysis that we conducted? In words that go off the bottom of the slide, we analyzed every single OS security and firmware update that Apple released since 10.10. So that's like 3 and a bit years worth of updates. And we extracted all of those updates out. And then from that package that Pepijn mentioned earlier, the firmware update PKG, within that package, there can be tens to hundreds of EFI updates within there. In parallel with this, we also got real world data from over 73,000 systems, obviously Apple systems, so that we could see the state of EFI actually installed in the real world, and then compare and contrast this idealized data set to the real world data set. And we also had many, many conversations with all sorts of people, including Apple themselves, to try and both understand and verify the results that we were seeing, because we were quite surprised by some of those results. And in a more graphical form, we extracted out all of the updates from the EFI updates from the OS and security updates. Then we built a data set of triplicates. So the build number is a way to uniquely identify any particular version of OS 10 or macOS. The numbers that you will hear thrown around more often, like 10, 12, 6, are fine when that is the most recent version of the OS that Apple is supporting. As soon as it flips into security updates, so now 10.13 is out, 10.12 is flipped into security updates. So its version number will forever sit at 10.12.6. It'll be 10.12.6, and then security update 2017-001. A build number will identify exactly which patch level you're on. So from we extracted the build number, the board ID, as Pepijn also mentioned earlier, the board ID is the only way that we can specifically identify the model of hardware which is being referenced by the EFI update. EFI is very, very specific to the hardware. So if you took one EFI and tried to install it on a different system, you would likely break that system and it wouldn't reboot. So we have the OS build number that specifically identifies the OS version. We've got the board ID, which specifically identifies the hardware version. And then we've got the EFI version. And it's that triplicate between those three that we build up our data set from. Each of these, for a particular version of the OS on a particular model of hardware, there should be a single version of EFI, which is the most recent version that should install. And we can declare that because those versions of EFI are shipped in the OS and the security updates, which ties them one-to-one to a particular build number. Again, this is what makes the analysis on the Apple side much, much easier than on the Wintel side. So once we've got that data set, the first step of analysis that we do is really we looked for anomalies in the EFI firmware that Apple had released, and we found a number of them. The second phase of research is then gathering a similar data set from real-world systems. So again, we're building up exactly the same triplicate. we're getting the build number from the real world Mac, what version of the OS is it running, what's its board ID, what's its hardware version, and then what version of the EFI is running. Now we've got two comparable data sets. We compare those data sets, and the second step of analysis is looking for discrepancies between these two data sets. Then there's some profit or conclusions, and then the plant names are happy. So, building up a detailed picture, like I said, there's these triplicates. This is a typical build number. This is 10.12.6, I think. The first two digits are the major version of the OS, and then the last ones, the last three are really just an incrementing build number. Mac model and board ID, as Pepijn also explained earlier, and then the EFI version. There's no, the naming of the EFI files is often named to match a particular model of hardware, but as was mentioned, some EFI files will actually apply to more than one Mac model if they're essentially internally the same. So there's a good rule of thumb, but not to be completely trusted. And in human language, this is 10.12.6, 27-inch 5K late 2014 iMac running EFI version 0207 build 29. So these are the triplicates that we built up. And then we tabulated, this is just like a snippet, there's more of this data in the paper that we released, but we tabulated up all of these triplicates over all of the updates and all of the versions of Apple hardware over the period that we were looking at, which is 10.10, 10.11, 10.12, and 10.13. And we used these kind of big-ass data sets to start to look for the anomalies. Some of it was pretty manual, some of it was automated. The second phase, now we are looking into analyzing data from the real-world system. So that first phase was just looking at what Apple had released. The second phase is looking at what's out there. So through friends of Pepijn, we managed to get data from over 73,000 systems. Of those 73,000 systems, 54, almost 55,000 of them were running 10.10, 10.11, or 10.12. At the point in time when we were doing this research earlier in the year, these were the 10.12 was the most recent version of OS 10 or macOS, and 10.11 and 10.10 were the versions that were still seen as security supported by Apple. So we constrained the real world data set to systems that were running 10.10, 10.11, or 10.12. Quite honestly, if you're running a version of OS 10 that's older than 10.10, EFI security is the least of your problems. So we cut down this data set to about 55,000. And like we say, because of this one-to-one pairing, because the EFI versions are included within the OS updater itself, if you're running OS version, let's say 10.12.6, we know exactly which EFI version should be running on 10.12.6 because it was bundled with the OS update. So we can start to ask questions around, from this data set, which combinations of OS and hardware are running an unexpected version of EFI, because there is no reason that an EFI should not have updated because it came bundled with the OS. And so we have two similar data sets we compare and contrast. We did things like big visualizations to try and help us, given the size of the data sets that we're working with. This is just supposed to be pretty. The yellow bobs are like the areas that were being highlighted that we then dug in and did more manual analysis on. So what did we find?
Everything is cool. No problems. Everyone go home. No, we found some things. So we found a number of things. First of all, real-world systems are out of date or out of sync as far as what they are expected to be. Also, we noticed that the security updates that are sent out after the OS version shifts a full number. Also gradually drops the EFI model support that comes with it. It's not something that's really publicized by Apple. Also quiet failures, lack of visibility. So like I said before, if it doesn't go through, there's no way of finding out other than going to look for the information. And we also found some unexplained update progressions where Apple seemed to ship the wrong things at the wrong time. So successful update does not mean successful firmware update. As said, the EFI updater gets one chance to get it right, and if that doesn't go through, it simply gets out of sync. So we gathered data from various EDU and enterprise organizations who submitted to us the data as mentioned, anonymized. There was really no way we smushed it all together into one data set, and we got the data that would help us compare that. And then we measured some non-compliant records there. And the question was, which model X with OS version Y has an EFI version that is older than it should be according to our lookup table? And we found that overall, across all models and OS versions, 4.2% were running an incorrect EFI version, meaning older than what they should be. It's a pretty significant number. It's not mind-blowing, but it's also not in the very low tenths of a percent, so 4.2%. And this breaks out across the board kind of differently. Most out-of-date model was actually a pretty recent iMac model that was almost 43% of those were out of date. And the then current OS at the time, when isolated for just 10.12, was actually 10% out of date, which goes up on the concerning scale. And then 10.11 was out of date 2.1%, and 10.10 3.4. So it seemed to kind of go back and forth as far as out of date numbers. This is a capture from our paper. It's all listed in there, so feel free to go check that out as well. But this lists by model number the most out of date systems. And if you look here, you can see that actually some of these are pretty new numbers, models, especially the MacBook Pro 13,2, which is the 2016 Touch Bar MacBook Pro, was particularly out of date for unknown reasons, really.
So the previous set of findings indicated that there's some problems with the way that the firmware update bundle is getting installed or not getting installed. So the OS update worked. The EFI version is not at the expected level because for some reason that EFI update didn't take. But we can also be in a different way of being insecure. There's a different state that we can be in, which is software secure but firmware vulnerable. So as mentioned, Apple tends to support the current latest version of its OS and then the previous two. So right now, 10.13 is the most recent. 10.12 and 10.11 are considered still under security support. And being still under security support, they will get issued security patches. So that's these security updates that you see being released alongside 10.13.1. Will also come out with a security update for 10.12 and a security update for 10.11. So it's this kind of like N-2 rule. And this deprecation cycle, Apple don't really officially say that this is what they do, but this is what they've been doing for years, and this is what people expect. So the question was around kind of, if you're still supported in terms of getting security updates for Apple, you're on one of these N-1 or N-2 OS versions, are you still getting firmware updates? And so we ran the numbers on that, and the numbers are pretty damning, are we fair? So if we're looking at models of Mac, so these big green numbers are the models of Mac that received an EFI update within that firmware update bundle within the OS update. So we can see at the time of this analysis, 10.12 was the latest version. So we can see that within the latest version of 10.12.6, and then these are the two security updates, there were 43 models of Mac that received an EFI update. There were 31 models of Mac that received an EFI update for 10.11, and there was only one model of Mac that received an EFI update for 10.10. So to our question, are all versions of OS treated equally? Absolutely not. The older your OS, the less likely it is that you're able to see or you will receive EFI updates. I'm going to dig a little bit more into that in a bit. So this is quite worrying. There's no reason that Yosemite should not receive an EFI update because the EFI is independent of the OS. So if there's something to change here, there's no reason that it shouldn't be across the board for all supported OSs. This is just one snapshot. Pretty much every update saw this trend and followed that trend. And a patch for one doesn't mean a patch for all. So digging into that more, well, cool. There may only be 31 versions, models of Mac that are seeing an EFI update for 10.11, but how does that really map against real-world vulnerabilities? So Coming back to the research that we cited earlier, we pulled out these 4 CVEs. These 4 CVEs are specific against known EFI vulnerabilities: Thunderstrike 1, Thunderstrike 2, Ulfrisk's DMA attack, and then another attack by Xenocova that hasn't got a snappy name. It was basically just being able to abuse unused EFI functions. So when we mapped these 4 CVEs to the updates that were being released by Apple, we wanted to see which models were receiving updates to address these vulnerabilities. And these big numbers here now are the number of models that did not receive an EFI update to address these vulnerabilities. So Thunderstrike 1, which is the oldest one discussed, there were 47 models of Mac that never received an EFI update to address that vulnerability. 31 for Thunderstrike 2, 25 for Xenocova's misuse of unused EFI functions, and 22 for Ulfrisk's DMA attacks. So again, this is quite surprising, right? These are public vulnerabilities that have got a CVE number that Apple have patched for some systems, but not for others. And the kicker here is that while the release notes for an OS update or a security update coming from Apple will reference these CVEs, will say that there are fixes included there, they don't actually tell you which model that they're included for. And then if we break down to the previous slides where we're discussing the differences between versions of EFI that were being patched on different OSs, now we can see why we needed these triplicates of hardware version, OS version, and was an EFI update released. So this is pretty worrying. We were surprised by this. We were expecting a much more consistent level of patches to be released when it was a known security vulnerability, as opposed to just maybe some bug or some update to the EFI environment itself.
And we also isolated a number of models that we call EFI orphans. What that means is that up till 10.12, the build numbers, the last part of the EFI version here, the build number, would steadily tick up into the 20s, 30s. There are a number of models that ship from the factory, generally speaking, with low build numbers, 0001. We found a number of models that, over the course of their life, never changed the build number. So other models would slowly get increasing build numbers, ostensibly because patches were included. These models never saw anything other than what they shipped from the factory with, and we broke that down to models that didn't receive any EFI updates, so they were still at build 00, or they stayed the same across the timeline, or models with only EFI versions, factory EFI versions, so measured at when they actually shipped to the world. Those versions also didn't change. So 16 of those models never received any EFI updates, and then 18 were left with their factory EFI versions. It could be because Apple didn't deem them necessary to get updates, or simply because they were left behind. It's hard to tell, but there were quite a few that never saw updates there. And this is an overview of that table. So these numbers are based on real world data. This is a snippet from the paper as well. We have a full data set in there, so you're welcome to check that out in greater detail. And then, of course, because these updates are silent, they will also fail silently, as we said before. Because Apple needed this to work at opportune times when users already are rebooting, because there's an OS update, they rolled it into a sort of a slipstream system. But it also means that it gets one shot, and if it fails, there's no messaging to the user that anything was wrong. In fact, they will go and check to see if their OS version is now one more than it should be, or whatever it said when they ran it. They see, oh, my version is up to date. It must be cool. Let's move on. So that is, it's a deceptive, well, not deceptive in a malicious way, but deceptive in that you can't really tell if anything happened unless you know what to go look for. And then it's not something an end user definitely will go look for, because it is an unknown system, and really anyone who isn't digging into this will never know to make this a case. So often EFI, as we see from our numbers, EFI is out of date. And we also found some QA issues, Rich.
Well, we believe there are QA issues. That's what we're asserting.
Possibly.
So through all of that offline analysis of all of the EFI updates that were included with the various OS updates and security updates, as we were tabulating these things out, there was this particular security update. So security update 2017-001. So the first security update of this calendar year for 10.10 and 10.11. We exploded out those bundles to look at the EFI versions that were contained. And we found that the EFI that was included in these security updates was actually older than the previous version that Apple had released. So essentially, they were shipping deprecated versions of EFI with a newer security patch level. And the updates that were included in the 2017-001 were actually exactly the same EFI versions, and I mean, code for code, we did the checksums over everything, as the releases, the EFIs that were released with security update 2016-002. So they've essentially shipped a regression, and this is again, pulled from the paper. We can see really the B number here is what you're wanting to look at. We can see, let's say, an iMac 13,1. We can see in 2017-001, it's got a build number of 09. For the previous patch, 2016-003, it had 10. And then in the previous but one patch, 002, it's back at 9. So basically, the firmware update package that was released with these security updates was exactly the same firmware update package that was released 2 versions before. So it's a regression. We were surprised at this. From our conversations with Apple, they seem relatively surprised as well. The last time that we checked, these updates still actually contain the old EFI firmware. We reckon it's a QA issue. It was just a model on the back end. The wrong. QA is hard at the best of times. QA on firmware, I'm sure, is harder. The next question that should be popping up in your head is well, if anybody installed 2017-001, did they downgrade their EFI to an older version that potentially was vulnerable? Well, luckily not, but not through Apple trying. So when you installed this, you went through the exact same process that Pepijn outlined earlier. The particular correct EFI was identified. It was dumped into the EFI partition. It was blessed. Some NVRAM updates were done. Reboot was issued. And then control is passed back to EFI. So EFI is only ever updated from EFI. You never actually update EFI from the OS itself. So the whole update process had put the old firmware file in place, ready for it to be flashed. However, in the EFI preboot environment where the update actually takes place, it does a variety of other validation and checks. One of the validations it does is code signing, making sure the EFI bundle that you're looking to flash is actually authored by Apple. That's always a good thing before you flash your EFI. It also does a date check or a version check, deliberately to stop you being able to roll back to an old version. So while these old versions of EFI were set to be installed, some of the security characteristics of the EFI update process itself saved us from rolling back. You can set, there's a parameter that you can set within an EFI update environment that basically says don't allow rollback. The reason that you wouldn't want to allow rollback, why this is a good thing for security, is, for example, if I had compromised the system, I could then go through the standard Apple EFI update process to install an old version of EFI that I know has got a vulnerability, so then I can exploit that vulnerability and get my code into EFI. So the rollback protection is a great security protection and protected users in this case from not installing old versions of the EFI. So the regression shipped, but it didn't actually have a negative impact for the users because of the checks that were actually in the EFI update environment itself. So not a big security issue, definitely interesting in terms of looking at Apple's QA process. Yep. I guess that's a slide that says words that I've just said with my mouth, so we'll skip by that. Mitigations. So we've spoken about a lot of problems. Pepijn is going to tell you how to fix things and make everything right.
Yeah, so because we kind of wanted to look at what is being done by Apple about these issues, what can we do about actually helping folks to discover this and do some mitigation. So we'll go through this real quick here. So upgrading to macOS 10.13 is a good first step. Logging, reporting, running updates out of band, and also some of the things Apple is doing is helping, and this refers back to EFI check as well. So, of course, first thing you can do, because of aforementioned requirement for APFS to have EFI support, if you upgrade to 10.13, you will get another shot at running your EFI updates, as well as you'll get the EFI check functionality as well to keep a closer eye on its integrity as well. I hear you're thinking 10.13, is that the one where you can get easy root access? Yes, it is. Apple has patched that. So they're kind of in a crappy situation where right now 10.13 is not looking so great. But I would say it is still your best bet as far as like support for EFI updates and various other mitigations for other issues that are outside of EFI. To deploy this. And actually, we noticed that Apple started shipping these EFI updates with APFS support back in 10.12.5, actually before 10.13 released, and as well, again, in 10.12.6. Our assumption, or our sort of what we assume here, is, which is another word for assumption, is that Apple knew that these updates don't always take, and if someone runs 10.13 and then their EFI doesn't get updated, they're basically stuck in the mud because APFS now cannot be booted from. So they started to kind of precede these EFI updates in the previous OS in the hopes that they would cover more systems before 10.13 went live in full. You can use a number of tools out there to actually get this information. I've listed a few here: OS Query, Popular, Puppet, Chef. You can also use a good old shell script if you have a way to send those out to get the same information. Want to point out that the folks at Trail of Bits are actually working on an extension for OS Query that will check against an API that we will talk about in a minute. They are working on this. Go check that out. There's a branch being worked on right now. Very useful tool to get this information across a larger fleet. So what can you do? You can reinstall the OS security update. If you install the same one that was previously installed, you will not break anything. You will just get another shot at installing the EFI. You can do the YOLO option and create your own standalone installer. This is not something Apple recommends, so I will not recommend it in case you break it and come to me. But it is a way to do this as well. There's a link down there as well for a popular system management tool that actually runs you through the process. Rich, tools and API releases.
So rather than just finding problems, we also like to try and help people get to a better state. So we wrote a bunch of tools and have released them open source. They come under the name Effigy. Can't take any credit for that. That's all Papine. The focus of Effigy was, and as we've seen from the data analysis that we did, it can be both difficult to get at the versions of the data that you want, as well as then to infer, is this the correct version of the EFI that I'm running, or am I running an out-of-date, possibly vulnerable version? It took two researchers a good 3 months to kind of compile and chunk through this data. Most teams, most sysadmins don't have that level of time and would just like something easier. So we built a bunch of tools to help with that. Really, at its core, Effigy is just a RESTful API that encapsulates the data set that we've built up and are continuing to add to on the back end. And there's a small client that queries that, sends up the right version numbers so you can get back, are you running the expected version of EFI, et cetera. So it's pretty straightforward. It kind of identifies what version of EFI you should be running compared to the version of EFI that you are running. Certain particular combinations of hardware, software that we know have EFI problems should be flagged up. New stuff's getting added to it all the time. It's on GitHub, so we'll send you the link in its own slide in a minute. If and when you find bugs, please just raise them to us and we'll try and get them fixed as quick as we can. It now supports 10.10 through 10.13. 10.13 is a recent addition because we didn't have that data until recently. And we built a lot of the tooling around trying to help Mac admins deal with this at scale. So if you're dealing with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of Mac systems, and you're asking the question, which of them are running out-of-date vulnerable EFI, that can be a pretty big task. So we wanted to build the tooling to try and help those sysadmins kind of deal with it at scale. So how does it work? Really, we're just pulling out 5 key bits of information. The EFI ROM version, so that's the EFI version that we've been speaking of, OS build number that we've mentioned before, the system board ID, so now we've got that triplicate. This is the triplicate that then we compare to the data set. We're also grabbing the SMC ROM version. We're hoping to extend our research out into SMC work in future, so we want to start to build up a data set of that. And then we also include a hash system UUID tag. We wanted to call this out because people can sometimes get a little bit nervous about SysUID because it uniquely identifies a hardware platform. We wanted to do this so we could aid analysis on the back end, so we could see repeat people calling the API and disambiguate them. So we essentially blind hashed the system UUID. So we take the system's MAC address, we concatenate with the system UUID, and then we SHA-256 it. This means that we're going to get unique values so we can disambiguate the data on the back end, but we have no visibility to either the secret salt that's used or to the UUID. So it's pseudonymous, and this enables our data analysis, but doesn't infringe any PII or any identifiable information. The API server itself isn't really a server. It's a big chunk of Python built on top of it's a big fat AWS Lambda, really, built on top of the Chalice framework. If you're not familiar with the Chalice framework, check it out. It's super cool. Allows you to take a big chunk of Python and make it into a server that automatically scales, so that's nice. And we've got like a pretty nice back-end tool flow where all of that analysis and extraction of the EFI updates from the OS updates and security updates kind of happens automatically, and we've got it to the point that really the server code is actually written as an output from that analysis itself. So things are just running in the background. New server code is being spat out all the time. And the RESTful API is like super straightforward. So if you look at the client on GitHub, it's super, super straightforward. You could easily write your own client. Pepijn mentioned there's an OS query module being built to directly query against the API and not have to use the effigy client. It's got a command line version, which looks really exciting. You'll see what's being sent up and then various checks that are being done. There's a GUI version if the CLI version is much better for its scale. The GUI version is great if people just want to kind of check their own home instance. There's also a web app version that's great for the same thing. And this is something that we wanted to share. The effigy API data we've been gathering on the back end specifically to answer some questions of, was our initial real world data reflective of like most normal people's use of it? So over the time that we've released the API, we've had about 133,000 queries, which is a pretty good data set, from about 9,000 unique endpoints. So that's 9,000 of those pseudonymous identifiers. The interesting thing here, and this is probably the big takeaway, we were expecting the number, 4.2% was the average that we cited earlier that was out of date from our real world data set. From the effigy data that we're getting, it's actually looking more like 20% is the average number of people that are running unexpected versions of EFI, given their hardware version and their OS version. This is much higher than we had expected. And here's some specifics about which model and OSs are like most out of whack. Interestingly, the number of systems running 10.13 is actually much lower than we expected. So here's some pretty graphs. You can see that 10.6 is the most installed version of the OS that's hitting the API, and it drops off pretty rapidly from there, with the most recent version of 10.11 following. We don't hit 10.13 until around here. This is across build numbers. Again, this is just showing that 10.12.6, the latest security update for 10.12.6, is the most prevalent. The most out-of-date model of Mac is a MacBook Pro from about 2015, I think. MacBook Pro 12.1. This is a better distribution, but you can see a huge deviation between some models that seem to have incredibly consistent EFI versions based on their hardware and their OS, and then some that are far more divergent. We can't explain why EFI updates well and installs well on some systems and not on others. We can just observe the empirical data of that is happening. We don't know what the problem is that's possibly inhibiting these EFI installs landing correctly. And then this is a different cut of data across which is the most prevalently mismatched EFI version. We're going to release all this data so you can dig in and click around. So conclusions, we've covered a lot. I think one of the key things that certainly if you're working for a vendor here, being transparent with what you are and aren't patching is key, especially in the firmware space. It's invisible to most users, and if you're not really explicit about what you are and aren't patching, the user's not going to know and is going to have to do a huge amount of work like we did. We can absolutely be in states where we're software secure but firmware vulnerable. Not all hardware is treated equally by manufacturers, so don't fall into the trap that if one system was patched, all other systems will be patched. QA is clearly hard, regressions will ship. And think about EFI less like a BIOS and more like a full mini OS. In almost every instance, the way that you would define an operating system, EFI meets that definition. It's essentially a mini OS that boots before it then hands over control to your full OS. So if we think of it like a mini OS, we need to treat it like a mini OS when we're thinking about patching and applying security updates to it. And again, just to reiterate, we actually believe Apple's taking EFI security really seriously, doing a great job compared to many other vendors, despite the problems that we found. So there's a paper. This link here is going to be the latest version of the paper, which is updated for the 10.13 data. We've got a blog post and the effigy tooling. If you just go to effigy.io, you'll find everything that you need. I think that's a lot. Thank you.